The scent of cinnamon and baked apples, a ghost of his wife Eleanor's love, filled Samuel's small, tidy kitchen. At 80 years old, his movements were deliberate, each one a familiar ritual honed by decades of repetition. He carefully lifted the pie from the oven, its golden crust a testament to a recipe passed down through generations, a recipe he now followed with a kind of sacred reverence. He placed it on the counter to cool, next to the worn wooden bowl filled with potato salad. He was preparing for the annual family barbecue. It was the highlight of his social calendar, a day he looked forward to with the simple, unadulterated joy of a man whose world had shrunk but whose heart had not. He pictured the scene. His son, Robert, manning the grill with a self-important air. His daughter-in-law, Susan, arranging salads on the picnic table with a tight, polite smile. And Leo, his 12-year-old grandson, his only grandson, running across the lawn, his laughter the sweetest music Samuel knew. He glanced at the clock. 2 p.m. He had another hour before he needed to leave. He went into his bedroom and laid out his best shirt, a soft blue plaid that Eleanor had always said brought out the color of his eyes. He polished his old leather shoes until they shone with a dull, respectable gleam. He was a man of simple means, a retired steel worker who had lived his entire life in this small house, but he believed in showing respect and making an effort for family. As he was tying his shoes, the phone rang. He smiled. It was probably Robert, calling to see if he needed a ride. He walked into the living room and picked up the receiver. "Hello? Grandpa?" The voice on the other end was small, thin, and trembling with a fear that instantly extinguished Samuel's cheerful anticipation. It was Leo. "Leo, what's wrong, son? You sound upset." "Grandpa," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't come. Please, don't come to the barbecue." Samuel frowned, confused. "Not come? Why not? I've got your grandmother's apple pie right here. It's still warm." He tried to keep his tone light, assuming it was some kind of childish game or a fleeting argument with his parents. "No, Grandpa, you don't understand," Leo insisted, his whisper growing more urgent, more desperate. There was a sound of a door closing softly in the background. "I heard them. I heard Mom and Dad talking last night." A cold knot began to form in the pit of Samuel's stomach. "Heard what, Leo? What did they say?" They said today was the day they were going to solve the grandpa problem." The boy's words were punctuated by a choked sob he was trying to suppress. "Dad said he was tired of waiting. He said he has papers for you to sign. Something about your pension, so he can manage it for you." Samuel sank into his worn armchair, the phone pressed hard against his ear. The familiar, comfortable room suddenly felt alien. The cheerful sunlight streaming through the window a cruel mockery. Manage his pension? Robert had mentioned something about that a few weeks ago, something about simplifying his finances, but Samuel had dismissed it as another of his son's fleeting, ill-conceived ideas. "And then what, Leo?" Samuel asked, his own voice now a hoarse whisper. "And then?" Leo's voice broke completely. "And then Mom said it was for the best, because you're not all there anymore. And Dad said they'd take you to that nice place on Monday, the one they showed you the brochure for. Grandpa, they're not going to let you come home." The knot in Samuel's stomach tightened into a block of ice. Sunny Meadows. He said the name of the retirement home out loud, the cheerful, innocuous words tasting like poison in his mouth. He remembered the glossy brochure Susan had left on his coffee table a month ago. A vibrant community for your golden years. He had thought it was a tasteless hint, a passive-aggressive nudge. He had never imagined it was a concrete plan. The barbecue wasn't a celebration. It was an ambush. The smiling faces, the hot dogs, the apple pie, it was all a stage set for the final, gentle betrayal. They were going to use the warmth of a family gathering to disarm him, to get his signature on a document that would strip him of his independence and then discard him. A wave of cold, clear fury washed over him, so potent it momentarily eclipsed his shock and grief. He thought of his son, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, the man whose college education he had paid for with decades of sweat and aching muscles. He thought of Susan, her polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes, her subtle, constant condescension. But then he thought of Leo, his brave, wonderful Leo, who was risking his parents' wrath to make this call, a 12-year-old boy hiding in his room, whispering a warning that had just saved his grandfather's life. "Leo," Samuel said, forcing his voice to be calm and steady, "listen to me very carefully. You're a good boy. You're a very brave, good boy. Do you understand?" "But what are you going to do?" Leo sobbed. "You're not to worry about me," Samuel said firmly. "I'm going to be just fine. I want you to hang up the phone now, go outside, and act like nothing has happened. Can you do that for me?" "Okay, Grandpa," the boy whispered. "And Leo?" "Yes, I love you. Never forget that." "I love you too, Grandpa." The line went dead. Samuel sat holding the receiver for a long time, the dial tone a monotonous, lonely hum. He looked around the room, at the photographs of Eleanor on the mantelpiece, at the worn furniture that held the imprint of their shared life. This was his home, his sanctuary, and they had planned to tear him from it like a weed from a garden. He slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. His hands were trembling, but not from age or fear. It was the tremor of a profound, seismic shift. The man who had been preparing to attend a family barbecue just 10 minutes ago was gone. In his place sat a man who had just been handed a declaration of war. And Samuel, who had worked and fought his entire life, knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not going to lose. The silence that followed Leo's call was heavier than any Samuel had ever known. It was filled with the ghosts of the past, with the echoes of promises made and sacrifices rendered invisible. He sat in his worn armchair, the scent of the cooling apple pie a cruel reminder of the love he had so willingly offered, and the betrayal he had so narrowly escaped. His mind, sharp and clear despite what his children believed, began to travel back in time, sifting through the decades, searching for the moment the cracks had begun to form. He thought of the steel mill. 42 years of his life had been spent in its fiery belly. He remembered the deafening roar of the machinery, the searing heat that radiated from the furnaces, the metallic taste of the air that clung to his clothes and his skin. He remembered coming home each day, his body aching, his hands calloused and raw, his face smudged with grease and grime. But he had never complained. Every drop of sweat, every strained muscle had been an investment in a future he was building for his family. He remembered Robert as a boy, small and bright-eyed, waiting for him at the door. "Did you make steel today, Dad?" he would ask, his voice full of awe, as if his father were a modern-day Vulcan, forging the world with his bare hands. Samuel would scoop him up, his rough hands gentle, and tell him, "I did, son, so that one day you won't have to." That had been the driving force of his life, to give Robert a world without the grit and the heat, a world of clean hands and open doors. He and Eleanor had been a team, a silent, efficient partnership in the business of sacrifice. She was the master of their meager budget, stretching every dollar until it cried for mercy. She turned old curtains into new shirts, made stews that could feed an army from a handful of vegetables, and managed their savings with a quiet, fierce determination. They had put every spare penny into what they called the Robert Fund. It was for his college education. No one in their families had ever gone to college. It was their single, shared, all-consuming dream. They gave up vacations. They drove the same car for 20 years. They never ate at restaurants. Their lives were a testament to deferred gratification, a long, slow investment in their son's potential. And Robert had, for a time, been worthy of that investment. He had been a good student, smart and ambitious. He had gotten into the state university, and Samuel and Eleanor had wept with pride on the day they drove him to his dormitory. The Robert Fund had paid for his tuition, his books, his rent. It had paid for the future they had dreamed of for him. The change, Samuel now realized, had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly, after Robert married Susan. Susan came from a different world, a world of manicured lawns and quiet, inherited wealth. She was never overtly rude to them, but there was always a faint, condescending pity in her eyes when she visited their small, simple house. She would look at Eleanor's handmade doilies, at Samuel's worn armchair, at the simple, hearty food on their table, and her smile would be just a little too tight. Robert, eager to please his new wife, began to adopt her perspective. He started referring to his childhood neighborhood as rough. He would gently mock his father's simple tastes. The stories of the steel mill, which had once been tales of heroic labor, were now embarrassing anecdotes to be glossed over in front of his new, sophisticated friends. After Eleanor died, the change accelerated. The subtle condescension from Robert and Susan curdled into a barely veiled impatience. Their visits became less about connection and more about assessment. They would walk through the house, their eyes scanning for signs of his decline. "Dad, are you sure you should be climbing that ladder to clean the gutters?" "Dad, did you forget to pay the gas bill again? It was on the counter." "Dad, this house is just too much for you. We worry." They saw a forgetful old man rattling around in a house that was too big for him. They saw a liability, a problem that needed to be managed. They never saw the truth. They never saw the man who had built their comfortable lives on a foundation of his own aching back. And they certainly never knew about the other fund. Samuel smiled, a grim, humorless twist of his lips. He thought of Eleanor's quiet wisdom, her innate, peasant-like shrewdness. Sam, she had told him one night, years ago, after Robert had made a particularly cutting remark about their frugal lifestyle. "Love your son. Give him everything you can, but never show him all your cards. A man should always keep something for himself, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect." It had been her idea. While the Robert Fund was their primary focus, Eleanor had insisted they start a second secret account. The Rainy Day Fund, she called it. Into this account they had funneled small, almost insignificant amounts of money over the decades, a bonus from the mill, the proceeds from a small inheritance Eleanor received from a distant aunt, the money they saved by doing their own home repairs. Samuel, who knew nothing of stocks and bonds, had trusted Eleanor completely. She had a cousin who worked as a financial advisor, a quiet, unassuming man who had given her sound advice. She had invested their small savings in a portfolio of low-risk, high-yield stocks, blue-chip companies, utilities, the kind of boring, reliable investments that people like Robert and his friends would have scoffed at. Over 50 years, through market booms and busts, through recessions and recoveries, that small, secret fund had grown. Compounded interest, Eleanor had called it, the eighth wonder of the world. It had grown quietly, steadily, invisibly. It had grown into a fortune that would have staggered his children. They saw only the small pension from the steel mill. They saw the modest house, paid off decades ago, but in a neighborhood they now considered undesirable. They saw an old man whose only asset was the property he was sitting on. They had no idea that the quiet, forgetful old man they were planning to discard was, in fact, a wealthy man. Wealthier, probably, than Robert, with his mountain of debt and his desperate need to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't truly afford. Samuel looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the mantelpiece. Her smile was warm, her eyes full of a love that still felt as real as the chair he was sitting in. "You were right, my love," he whispered to the silent image. "You were always right." He had kept her secret. He had honored her wisdom. And now, that secret, that quiet act of self-respect from decades ago, was about to become his shield, his sword, and his salvation. As the initial shock and anger began to subside, replaced by a cold, clear resolve, Samuel's thoughts turned from his son's betrayal to his grandson's loyalty. He thought of Leo. In the desolate landscape of his family's deceit, the memory of his grandson's trembling, whispered warning was a solitary point of light, a beacon of pure, unadulterated love. His relationship with Leo had always been different. While Robert and Susan had drifted away into their world of social climbing and material ambition, Leo had, in his own quiet way, drifted closer. He was a thoughtful, observant boy, with his grandmother's kind eyes and a quiet curiosity that his parents seemed to neither notice nor encourage. While Robert saw a forgetful old man and Susan saw a symbol of a past she was desperate to escape, Leo saw only his grandfather. He saw the man who could fix anything, from a broken toy soldier to a wobbly bicycle chain. He saw the storyteller whose tales of the steel mill were not embarrassing anecdotes, but epic sagas of fire, sweat, and camaraderie. He saw the gardener whose gnarled, calloused hands could coax the most beautiful roses from the stubborn soil. Their time together was a world unto itself, a quiet rebellion against the values of Robert and Susan's household. They didn't go to expensive restaurants or shopping malls. They sat on the back porch and played checkers, the worn wooden pieces clicking softly in the afternoon sun. They worked in the garden, Samuel teaching Leo the names of the plants, the rhythm of the seasons. They would sit in Samuel's armchair, the boy's head resting against his grandfather's shoulder, and read the newspaper aloud. Leo patiently sounding out the difficult words, Samuel explaining the complexities of a world that seemed to be changing too fast. Now, in the harsh light of his son's betrayal, Samuel began to re-examine the past year and he saw it through a new lens. He saw a series of small, seemingly insignificant moments that were, in fact, evidence of Leo's growing awareness and quiet descent. He remembered a dinner a few months ago. Robert had been complaining about a senior moment Samuel had had, misremembering the date of a family event. "See, Dad," Robert had said with a sigh of exaggerated patience, "this is what we're worried about. Your memory is starting to slip." Samuel had felt a familiar sting of shame and frustration. But then he had seen Leo, sitting across the table, his small face tight with an emotion Samuel couldn't quite place at the time. The boy had looked down at his plate and muttered, so quietly that only Samuel had heard him, "You're not forgetful, Grandpa. You just remember different things." He remembered another time when Susan had been talking about the benefits of Sunny Meadows, her voice full of a bright, false enthusiasm. "They have a wonderful arts and crafts program, Dad. You'd love it." Leo, who had been quietly building a tower of blocks on the floor, had suddenly looked up and said, "But Grandpa already has an arts and crafts program. It's called his garden." Susan had laughed it off as a childish comment, but Samuel had seen the look in his grandson's eyes. It was a look of fierce, protective loyalty. The boy had seen the truth. He had seen the condescension, the manipulation, the slow, methodical campaign to paint his grandfather as incompetent. He had understood, with the clear, unclouded wisdom of a child, that his parents' concern was a mask for something else, something ugly and selfish. And that understanding had culminated in this morning's phone call. Samuel tried to imagine the courage it must have taken for a 12-year-old boy to do what Leo had done, to sneak away, to find a moment of privacy, to dial his grandfather's number, knowing he was defying his parents, the two most powerful figures in his world. He had risked their anger, their punishment, their disapproval, all to protect the old man he loved. It was an act of pure, selfless love, a gesture of loyalty so profound it brought tears to Samuel's eyes. In a world where his own son saw him as a problem to be solved, his grandson saw him as a person to be saved. He thought of the inheritance, the secret fortune that Eleanor had so wisely tucked away. For years, he had vaguely assumed it would go to Robert, a final, posthumous gift to the son they had sacrificed so much for. But now, that assumption felt like a betrayal of everything Eleanor had stood for. She had created that fund out of a desire for dignity and self-respect. To give it to a son who had tried to strip him of both would be a desecration of her memory. The true heir to Eleanor's legacy, he realized, was not the one who shared her blood, but the one who shared her heart. The true heir was the boy who understood that love is not about managing people, but about cherishing them. The true heir was the boy who had just proven, with one whispered phone call, that he was more of a man than his father would ever be. Samuel stood up and walked to his desk. He pulled out a small, locked box from the bottom drawer. Inside was a collection of Leo's childhood drawings, a photograph of him as a baby, and a small smooth stone the boy had given him years ago, for good luck. He held the stone in his palm, its coolness a comfort in weight. His decision was made. It was not a decision born of anger or revenge. It was a decision born of love and a profound, clarifying sense of justice. He would protect his grandson, just as his grandson had protected him. He would give his legacy to the one person who understood its true worth. Robert and Susan wanted his pension. They wanted his house. They could have them. They were fighting over the scraps. The real treasure, the future he and Eleanor had so carefully built, would go to the one who deserved it. It would go to Leo. The weekend passed in a state of surreal calm. Samuel moved through his house with a newfound sense of purpose. The quiet fury in his heart now channeled into a clear, cold, and methodical plan. He answered the phone when Robert called on Saturday, his voice a carefully constructed blend of weary confusion and mild apology. "I'm so sorry about the barbecue, son," he said, his voice deliberately frail. I wasn't feeling myself. Woke up with a terrible headache and just slept the day away. Old age, I suppose. See, Dad? This is exactly what we've been worried about." Robert's voice on the other end was a symphony of false concern, each note perfectly pitched to convey love and anxiety. "You shouldn't be alone. What if something serious had happened?" "I'm fine, Robert, really," Samuel murmured. "Just a bad day." "We'll come by tomorrow, bring you some soup," Robert insisted. "We need to talk. We need to make sure you're taken care of." "That would be nice," Samuel said, and then hung up, a grim smile touching his lips. The trap was still set. His children were still circling, confident that their prey was weak and unsuspecting. They had no idea that the prey was now the hunter. On Monday morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, Samuel walked out of his house, not to wait for his son's visit, but to catch the bus downtown. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a pressed shirt, a clean tie, and the sturdy, polished shoes he had worn to Eleanor's funeral. He carried a worn leather briefcase that had sat in his closet for 20 years. Inside was the small locked box containing his most precious documents. His destination was the old granite building that housed the law offices of Henderson, Black and Associates. Mr. Henderson, a man now as old as Samuel himself, had been his lawyer for 40 years. He was a man of quiet integrity, a relic from an era when a handshake was a bond and a man's word was his honor. Mr. Henderson greeted him with a warm, familiar handshake, his eyes full of a gentle concern. "Samuel, it's good to see you, though I confess your call this morning sounded urgent." "It is, Arthur," Samuel said, taking a seat in the large, comfortable leather chair opposite the lawyer's mahogany desk. "I need to make some changes to my estate plan, significant changes." He did not tell his old friend the full, sordid story of his children's betrayal. It was a matter of pride, but also of strategy. He simply said, "Eleanor and I always believed in planning for the future. I've come to realize that my vision for the future has evolved." He opened his briefcase and laid out the documents for the secret investment portfolio. Mr. Henderson's eyebrows rose as he reviewed the statements. He had known Samuel was a man of modest means. He had no idea he was a man of secret wealth. "This is quite substantial, Samuel," the lawyer said, a note of surprise in his voice. "It was Eleanor's wisdom," Samuel replied simply, "and I want to ensure that her wisdom is passed on to the right person." He then laid out his plan, his voice clear and unwavering. He did not want to simply amend his will. That could be contested, challenged, dragged through the courts for years by a greedy and determined son. He wanted to do something more immediate, more absolute. "I want to create an irrevocable trust," Samuel stated, "and I want to transfer all of these assets into it, effective immediately." "An irrevocable trust?" Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Samuel, you understand what that means. Once you place the assets in the trust, you can no longer control them. You cannot take them back. The decision is, as the name implies, irrevocable. I understand perfectly, Samuel said. That is precisely the point. And the beneficiary of this trust? My grandson, Leo Robert Miller. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the intricate details. Samuel was astonishingly clear-headed, his mind sharp and focused. He dictated the terms of the trust with a precision that impressed the old lawyer. The trust, to be named the Eleanor Miller Educational and Life Fund, would be managed by an independent trustee, Mr. Henderson himself, with his firm as the designated successor. The funds were to be used exclusively for Leo's benefit. His education, from private school to university, even postgraduate studies if he so chose. His health care, ensuring he would always have access to the best possible medical treatment, and a seed fund for him to start a business or purchase a home, to be made available to him upon his 25th birthday. Until then, the principal was to be untouchable, invested conservatively to ensure its continued growth. Leo was not to be informed of the trust's existence until his 18th birthday. I don't want him to grow up knowing he is a wealthy boy, Samuel explained. I want him to grow up to be a good man. I want him to learn the value of work, of integrity, of standing on his own 2 feet. This fund is not a gift to make his life easy. It is a tool to ensure he has the freedom to become the best version of himself, free from the financial desperation that seems to have poisoned his parents. He made one final, crucial stipulation. As for my own affairs, he said, I will retain control of this house and my monthly pension from the steel mill. They are more than enough for my needs. But all other assets, every stock, every bond, every dollar in that portfolio goes into the trust. Today. Mr. Henderson drew up the documents with a quiet efficiency. The paperwork was complex, the language dense, but Samuel read every line, his focus absolute. When it was time to sign, his hand was as steady as the steel he used to forge. He signed his name, the ink a dark, definitive mark on the page. With that single, quiet act, he had transferred a lifetime of secret savings, a fortune built on sacrifice and love, to his 12-year-old grandson. He had disinherited his own son, not with a dramatic clause in a will, but with a quiet, brilliant, and legally unassailable maneuver. As he stood up to leave, a profound sense of peace settled over him. It was the peace of a man who has put his house in order, who has secured his legacy. He had been a steel worker, a man who took raw, unformed materials and gave them strength and purpose. He had just done the same with his life savings. He had forged a future for the one person who had proven worthy of it. He walked out of the lawyer's office and into the bright afternoon sun, his briefcase now significantly lighter. He felt not a sense of loss, but of immense, liberating relief. He had protected his grandson, he had honored his wife, and now he was ready to go home and face his son. The trap was no longer his to fear. It was his to spring. Samuel returned home to a house that felt different. The air was lighter, the familiar rooms no longer shadowed by the lumen thread of exile. He had acted. He had taken control of his own destiny. Now, all that was left was to watch the final, sad act of his children's play unfold. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden, trimming Eleanor's roses, his movements calm and rhythmic. He felt a quiet satisfaction in the simple, honest work. This was real. The soil under his fingernails, the scent of the blossoms, the warmth of the sun on his back. This was his life, and he had just fought for it. At 6 o'clock, just as he was washing his hands at the kitchen sink, he saw Robert's expensive sedan pull into the driveway. Robert and Susan emerged, their arms laden with grocery bags, their faces arranged into masks of loving concern. It was a performance, and Samuel, now a member of the audience rather than an unwitting actor, watched it with a kind of detached, clinical curiosity. "Dad," Robert called out, his voice booming with a false heartiness as he walked through the back door. "We were so worried. We brought you some things. Soup, some fresh bread, that ginger tea you like." Susan followed, placing the bags on the kitchen counter with a flourish. "You gave us such a scare, Samuel," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made his teeth ache. "Not answering the phone all weekend. We thought the worst." "I was just feeling a bit under the weather," Samuel said, playing his part, his voice deliberately weak. "This old body isn't what it used to be." "Exactly." Robert seized on the admission, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "That's why we can't have you living here alone anymore. It's just not safe." They fussed over him, heating the soup, setting the table, treating him like a fragile porcelain doll. They spoke to him in loud, slow, patronizing tones, as if his hearing and his intellect had vanished overnight. "Now, Dad," Susan said, sitting down opposite him at the kitchen table, her hands folded primly. "We need to have a serious talk, for your own good." Samuel sipped the soup they had brought. It was bland and watery, a pale imitation of the rich, homemade broth Eleanor used to make. "I'm listening," he said. "We've found the most wonderful place for you," Susan began, her voice taking on the smooth, persuasive cadence of a real estate agent closing a deal. "It's called Sunny Meadows. It's more like a resort than a retirement home. They have a golf course, a swimming pool, organized activities, and, most importantly," Robert interjected, "they have 24-hour medical staff on site, nurses, doctors on call. If you ever feel unwell again, like you did this weekend, there will be someone there to help you immediately." They painted a picture of a golden paradise, a worry-free existence where all his needs would be met, where he would be safe, secure, and, most importantly, out of their way. They spoke of it as a gift, a final, generous act of love from two devoted children. Samuel listened patiently, nodding in all the right places, his expression one of mild, dazed confusion. He let them talk, let them spin their web of deceit, let them convince themselves of their own benevolence. "It sounds very nice," he murmured when they had finished. "It is, Dad. It's perfect for you," Robert said, his relief palpable. He had expected a fight, an argument. He was getting easy compliance. "But all the paperwork," Samuel said, frowning as if trying to grasp a complex idea, "it seems so complicated." "Don't you worry about a thing," Susan said, patting his hand with a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt cold and reptilian. "We've taken care of everything. We've even arranged for a specialist to come by tomorrow to help you with the forms. He'll make it all very simple." A specialist. Samuel knew exactly what kind of specialist they meant. A notary, a lawyer, someone to witness his signature on the documents that would sign away his life. "He'll help you with the power of attorney, so I can manage your pension and pay the bills for Sunny Meadows," Robert explained, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "And the consent forms for the move. It's all standard procedure." "That's very thoughtful of you," Samuel said, his gaze distant. They stayed for another hour, their conversation relentlessly cheerful, their concern a suffocating blanket. They talked about their own lives, their plans for a kitchen renovation, a trip to Hawaii they were planning for the fall. They spoke as if he were already gone, a problem solved, his assets already mentally allocated to their own desires. When they finally stood up to leave, Robert gave his father a firm, proprietary pat on the shoulder. "You'll see, Dad. This is for the best. You're going to be so much happier." "We'll be back tomorrow with the specialist around 10, Susan added, her smile bright and brittle. "You just rest up." They walked out, leaving the half-eaten bowls of soup on the table. Samuel watched them go, their silhouettes framed for a moment in the doorway before they disappeared into the dusk. He did not feel anger. He did not feel sadness. He felt only a profound, weary sense of pity. They were so blinded by their own greed, so certain of his weakness, that they were walking with cheerful, confident strides directly into the trap he had set for them. They thought they were coming tomorrow to finalize his surrender. They had no idea they were coming to witness their own ruin. The next morning, Samuel woke not with dread, but with a calm, almost serene sense of anticipation. He made his coffee, read the morning paper, and tended to his roses, his movements unhurried. He was an actor preparing to take the stage for the final, most important performance of his life. At precisely 10 o'clock, Robert's sedan pulled into the driveway. Robert and Susan emerged, followed by a man in a crisp gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. This, Samuel knew, was the specialist. He was a short, balding man with nervous, darting eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. He looked less like a specialist and more like a man who was paid to look the other way. Samuel opened the door before they could knock, his expression a carefully crafted mask of mild, benevolent confusion. "Dad, you're up and about. That's wonderful," Robert said, his voice booming with false cheer. He ushered the specialist into the living room. "This is Mr. Davies. He's here to help us with all that complicated paperwork we talked about." "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Miller," Davies said, extending a soft, damp hand. "Your son and daughter-in-law have told me so much about you. It's wonderful that you have such a caring family looking out for your best interests." "Yes, isn't it?" Samuel murmured, his eyes meeting Robert's for a brief, unreadable moment. They all sat down in the living room, the room where Eleanor had hosted countless family gatherings, the room where Leo had built his block towers. Susan arranged a stack of documents on the coffee table with a brisk, efficient air. The specialist, Mr. Davies, opened his briefcase and produced a fountain pen, as if for the signing of a historic treaty. "Now, Samuel," Susan began, her voice soft and patronizing, "we know this can be a bit overwhelming, so we'll go through it slowly. This first document is just a simple power of attorney. It will allow Robert to manage your finances, pay your bills, handle your pension. It just simplifies things. So, you don't have to worry your head about it," Robert added with a reassuring smile. Mr. Davies pushed the document across the table. "Just sign here on the bottom line," he said, pointing with the tip of his expensive pen. Samuel picked up the document. He held it in his trembling hands, a tremor he deliberately exaggerated, and squinted at the dense legal text. He saw the clauses that would give Robert unlimited control over his bank accounts, his pension, his very financial existence. And this one?" he asked, pointing to the second stack of papers. "That's just the admission form for Sunny Meadows," Susan said brightly. "A formality. It confirms your consent to move into their wonderful community." "Consent." Samuel repeated the word softly, as if tasting it for the first time. "Exactly," Robert said, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "It's all very straightforward, Dad. Just a couple of signatures and we can take care of everything for you. No more worries, no more stress, just peace and quiet in a beautiful, safe place." Samuel looked at them. He looked at his son, his face a mask of greedy anticipation. He looked at his daughter-in-law, her eyes gleaming with triumph. He looked at the nervous specialist, a hired gun in a cheap suit. They were like vultures, circling, waiting for the final, inevitable moment. He picked up the pen. He uncapped it, the small click echoing in the silent room. He leaned over the coffee table, the pen poised over the signature line of the power of attorney. Robert and Susan leaned forward, their bodies tense, their breath held. And then Samuel put the pen down. He looked up, and for the first time that morning, the mask of confusion fell away. His eyes were clear, sharp, and full of a cold, hard light. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a thunderclap. Robert blinked, stunned. "What? Dad, what are you talking about? We just went over this." "I said, no," Samuel repeated, his voice stronger now, imbued with an authority they had not heard in years. Susan let out a short, sharp, exasperated laugh. "Samuel, don't be difficult. We're doing this for your own good. You're not well. You're confused." "Am I?" Samuel said, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips. "I don't feel confused. In fact, I don't think I've ever felt more clear-headed in my entire life." He leaned back in his armchair, the picture of calm authority. "It's a very interesting plan you've concocted," he said, his voice conversational. "Very thorough. You get control of my pension, you sell my house, you put me away where I can't cause any trouble. It's neat, tidy, profitable." Robert and Susan stared at him, their faces draining of color. The specialist, Mr. Davies, began to nervously shuffle his papers. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about," Robert stammered. "Don't you?" Samuel said. "Let me refresh your memory. You were going to solve the grandpa problem. You were going to get my signature and then I'd be off to a nice place on Monday, because I'm not all there anymore." He recited the words Leo had repeated to him, his voice a perfect, chilling echo of his son's own conversation. Robert looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "How? How could you possibly know that?" Susan whispered, her voice a strangled gasp. "Let's just say a little bird told me," Samuel said, his gaze hardening. "A little bird who, unlike his parents, still understands the meaning of love and loyalty." He reached down beside his armchair and lifted the worn leather briefcase he had taken to the lawyer's office. He placed it on the coffee table with a soft, definitive thud. "You see, Robert," he said, his eyes locking with his son's. "You're right about one thing. It is important to have your finances in order, which is why I took the liberty of doing just that yesterday." He opened the briefcase and took out a single, crisp document. It was a copy of the newly established trust agreement. "It's funny you should be so concerned about my assets," Samuel said, pushing the document across the table toward his stunned son. "Because, as of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I don't have any." He leaned back, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "I gave them all away, every last cent, to my grandson, Leo." The trust document lay on the coffee table like a bomb that had just been disarmed, its dense, legal text a testament to a battle that had been won before it had even begun. Robert picked it up with a trembling hand, his eyes scanning the pages with a frantic, disbelieving intensity. Susan snatched it from him, her own face a mask of horror as she read the clauses, the figures, the irrevocable transfer of a fortune she had considered her own. This is impossible," she breathed, the paper shaken in her grasp. "You can't do this. It's not legal." "Oh, I assure you, it is perfectly legal," Samuel said, his voice calm and steady. He gestured toward the nervous notary. "Mr. Davies here is a specialist in legal documents. I'm sure he can attest to the validity of a properly executed and witnessed trust agreement." Mr. Davies, caught in the crossfire, began to sweat profusely. He looked from Samuel's cold, confident face to Robert and Susan's apoplectic ones and made a swift professional calculation. The document appears to be in order," he stammered, quickly packing his briefcase. "My work here's done. I'll see myself out." He practically fled the room, leaving the family to the wreckage he had been hired to create. "You gave it all to Leo?" Robert finally found his voice, a choked, strangled sound. "A 12-year-old boy? Dad, have you lost your mind?" "On the contrary, Robert," Samuel replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "I have finally found it. I have placed my life savings in the care of the only person in this family who has demonstrated an ounce of integrity." "He's a child," Susan shrieked, her carefully constructed facade of concern shattering into a million pieces of raw, ugly greed. "He'll squander it. We are your family. We should be the ones to manage your affairs." "Manage my affairs?" Samuel let out a short, bitter laugh. "Is that what you call it? Scheming to steal my pension, sell my home, and lock me away in a nice place so you can enjoy the proceeds? That's not management, Susan. That's theft." "We were trying to protect you," Robert insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "You're old. You're forgetful. You're a danger to yourself." "The only danger I was in," Samuel said, standing up to face his son, his small frame radiating an immense, unshakable authority, "was from you. You saw my grief as weakness. You saw my age as an opportunity. You looked at your own father and saw not a man to be loved, but an asset to be liquidated." He walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photograph of a young, smiling Robert, sitting on his shoulders at a long-ago picnic. "I worked for 42 years in the heat and the noise of a steel mill for you," he said, his voice thick with the weight of decades of sacrifice. "I put you through college so you wouldn't have to break your back the way I did. Your mother and I went without so you would never have to. And this is how you repay us? By trying to steal the last vestiges of my dignity?" "It wasn't like that," Robert mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It was exactly like that." Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. "You stood in this very room and performed your little play of concern, all the while knowing you had a plan to strip me of everything I own. You are not my son, not anymore. My son would never have done this." Susan, seeing that pleading was useless, switched to threats. "We'll fight this," she hissed, her face contorted with rage. "We'll go to court. We'll prove you're mentally incompetent. We'll have you declared unfit to make your own decisions." Samuel smiled, a cold, pitying smile. "You are welcome to try," he said. "But my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, has already prepared for that eventuality. I've undergone a full psychiatric evaluation. I've signed affidavits. I have a dozen witnesses who will testify to my lucidity. And, most importantly, I have a very clear memory of a certain phone call from my grandson, detailing your entire, pathetic little plan." The mention of Leo was the final blow. Robert and Susan stared at him, the full scope of their defeat finally dawning on them. They had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and utterly defeated by the old man they had so carelessly dismissed. "And as for Leo," Samuel continued, his voice softening slightly, "you will not punish him for his loyalty. You will not speak a single harsh word to him about this, because if you do, I will use my pension, every last penny of it, to hire the best child advocacy lawyers in this state and prove that you are unfit parents. And I promise you, I will win." It was a masterful checkmate. He had protected his grandson, secured his legacy, and left them with absolutely nothing. They had no legal recourse, no moral high ground, no power left at all. "Now," Samuel said, his voice returning to a calm, dismissive tone, "I believe you are leaving." He walked to the front door and held it open. It was a gesture of final, absolute dismissal. Robert looked at his father, his face a maelstrom of emotions, shame, anger, and a dawning, horrified understanding of what he had just lost. It was not just the money. It was his father's love, his respect, his very place in the family he had just tried to destroy. "Dad," he began, his voice a broken whisper. "Get out," Samuel said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Get out of my house." They stumbled out, two defeated conspirators cast out into the harsh light of day. Susan was muttering curses under her breath. Robert was silent, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. Samuel watched them get into their expensive car and drive away, their tires screeching as they pulled out of the driveway. He closed the door, the soft click echoing in the now silent house. He was alone. But for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel lonely. He felt free. He had faced the greatest betrayal of his life and had emerged not as a victim, but as a victor. His house was his own again. His life was his own again. And his legacy was, at last, in the right hands. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, Samuel's house seemed to exhale. The oppressive atmosphere of deceit and manipulation had vanished, replaced by a clean, peaceful silence. He spent the rest of the day in his garden, not working, but simply sitting on the old wooden bench, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He had won. But it was a victory that brought him not triumph, but a profound, weary sadness for the son he had lost. He did not hear from Robert or Susan again. They disappeared from his life as completely as if they had never existed. Through the neighborhood grapevine, he heard that they had put their large, ostentatious house on the market and moved to a smaller, rented apartment in a different town. Their desperate grab for his assets had failed, leaving them to face the consequences of their own financial irresponsibility. Samuel's life, however, began to bloom. Freed from the emotional burden of his children's expectations, he found a new, quiet joy in his independence. He used his pension, now entirely his own, to live comfortably. He made small improvements to the house, bought a new, more comfortable armchair, and subscribed to the daily newspaper again. He reconnected with old friends from the steel mill, joining them for coffee on Wednesday mornings. their conversations a comfortable tapestry of shared memories and good-natured complaints about their aching joints. His most precious time, however, was spent with Leo. Their relationship entered a new, unspoken phase. Robert and Susan, perhaps fearing Samuel's threat of legal action, did not prevent Leo from seeing his grandfather. They would drop him off on Saturday mornings, their interactions with Samuel brief, formal, and strained. They would not meet his eye. They were ghosts now, haunting the periphery of a life they had tried to control. Samuel and Leo never spoke of the phone call, or of the trust, or of the dramatic events that had transpired. They didn't need to. There was a new, deeper understanding between them. Leo, with his quiet wisdom, seemed to sense that his grandfather had fought and won a great battle, and he treated him with a new level of gentle respect. Samuel, in turn, saw Leo not just as his grandson, but as his true heir, the vessel for all the love and wisdom he had hoped to pass on. He did not spoil the boy with gifts or money. Instead, he gave him something far more valuable: his time, his knowledge, his values. He taught Leo how to tend the roses, explaining the importance of patience and care. He taught him how to play chess, not just the moves, but the strategy, the foresight, the necessity of thinking several steps ahead. He told him stories, not just of the steel mill, but of his life with Eleanor, of the struggles they had faced and the love that had seen them through. He was building a foundation in the boy, a foundation of integrity, resilience, and compassion. One afternoon, as they were sitting on the porch playing checkers, Leo looked up at him. "Grandpa," he said, "are you happy?" Samuel was taken aback by the directness of the question. He looked out at his garden, at the familiar, comfortable lines of his home, at the bright, earnest face of the boy beside him. "Yes, Leo," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I am very happy." The story concludes several years later. Samuel's now in his late 80s, frailer, slower, but his eyes are bright and clear. He's sitting on the same porch, watching a now 17-year-old Leo read a letter. It is an acceptance letter from a prestigious university, offering a full scholarship for an engineering program. Leo looks up from the letter, his face alight with a joy that is pure and overwhelming. "I did it, Grandpa," he says. "They accepted me." "I never had a doubt," Samuel says, his voice full of pride. Later that day, Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, comes to visit. It is Leo's 18th birthday, the day he is to be told about the trust. They sit in the living room, and Mr. Henderson explains the full extent of the Eleanor Miller Educational and Life Fund. He shows Leo the statements, the portfolio, the staggering sum that has been growing in his name for years. Leo listens in stunned silence, his eyes wide with disbelief. When the lawyer has finished, he looks not at the documents, but at his grandfather. "But why?" he asks, his voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" Samuel reaches out and takes his grandson's hand. "Because a long time ago," he says softly, "when I was at my lowest point, you made a choice. You chose love. You chose loyalty. You chose to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Your grandmother and I, we didn't save all this money just to have it. We saved it so that one day it could give a good person the freedom to do great things. And you, Leo, you are the best person I know." He takes a small, worn stone from his pocket, the good luck charm Leo had given him as a child, and presses it into the boy's palm. "This is your true inheritance, Leo," Samuel says. "Not the money, The money is just a tool. Your inheritance is the love that created it and the integrity to use it wisely. Leo looks at the stone, then at his grandfather, his eyes filling with tears of understanding. He doesn't say anything. He just leans forward and hugs the old man, a long, heartfelt embrace that bridges the years and seals a legacy. Samuel sits on his porch long after Leo and the lawyer have gone, watching the sunset. He thinks of Eleanor, of their long life together, of the son who lost his way, and of the grandson who found his. He knows he doesn't have many years left, but he is at peace. His life's work is complete. His legacy is not in the steel he forged or the money he saved. It is in the character of the young man he has raised, a man who will go out into the world armed not just with wealth, but with the far greater treasures of love, loyalty, and a grandfather's unwavering belief in his goodness.